Hi, Dr. Natalie Edmond here from Mindful and Multicultural Counseling and Anti-Racism Revolution. And I'm thinking about this week how there's this team, this nonprofit I've been working with for probably about 2 years. And I meet with them usually once a month. We usually take a couple months off in summer, early fall, and how deep our conversations about race have gotten over time. I met with them this month after like a 3 or 4 month hiatus, or actually met with them this week. So 4 different groups, and it's kind of a joke among us that I can make everything about race. And so I often like to start the meeting with a little bit of mindfulness because I think it's important to drop into our bodies and shift gears, because I think many of us need to shift gears when we're talking about race because it brings up so much discomfort regardless of who we are as racial beings. And so my theme this week was about starting off talking about the NFL and the Super Bowl and the halftime game. And, point of reference that I've been boycotting the NFL since the treatment of Colin Kaepernick in 2016. And this week I chose to watch the halftime game with my 13-year-old and 15-year-old, because I thought, after a couple of years when you're boycotting something, the conversation moves on, and I want my kids to know why I don't watch football, why I don't participate, that it doesn't fit with my value system, because I think the NFL is such a great example of the way that structural racism exists, the way that racial inequities is built into who are the players, and how that doesn't translate, that a majority Black played sport doesn't translate into people in power, such as coaches or owners or people who are involved in the decision making. And think about how we could be having really deep conversations about being racial beings and the way that race shows up in our sports, in our television shows, in our magazines. And there's so much in the NFL that we could be talking about, that we can be building bridges or building racial literacy about. I probably went on a 10-minute little tutorial with my kids, but I thought it was so important for them. I know they were a little overwhelmed, but this is part of the way that I'm building racial literacy for them, right? That it's not by accident that a sport is dominated by Black players, and yet they are not seen as good enough or having the right skill set, or whatever the conversations may be about why they aren't ascending into coaching positions at the same rate as white people and other people, and how it's not reflected in ownership. Think about like the parallels between like the ways in which the slave auctions were done hundreds of years ago, and the ways in which, like, how does that show up in the ways in which we evaluate Black men's bodies for sport. I think about all the misogyny and rape culture that's built into so many male-dominated spaces. I think about discrimination against sex workers and the policing that happens in towns, particularly that host a Super Bowl. And I think about just even how like epic it is to have two Black quarterbacks, when historically it's been a sport in which white people are viewed as qualified to be the quarterback. And how does this conditioning begin when these guys are kids, in terms of which where they're told, what positions they're told to play in, and just how that is conditioned, and the biases we might internalize. I also think about the number of people of all different racial identities who watch the NFL, who watch the Super Bowl, and are complicit, right, in the systems continuing as they are. How uncomfortable it makes people for the Black national anthem to be played, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And, ways that we can use these teachable moments to figure out, like, why is there a Negro national anthem? What's the significance of it? I know every time that I hear Lift Every Voice and Sing, there's something that just touches my soul. The significance of a Black interpreter, female, and that's the video I showed as my mindfulness practice, is watching the Black national anthem sung and the sign language used, and celebrating Black life in this way. So I think about, even though I've been in this Black body my whole life, I didn't always think that race was in everything. I thought race was some things. And I guess the invitation is, how do we begin to filter the world, particularly the United States world, through the perspective of race? Not the lens, the perspective. And because it's there, just have we built the muscle? Have we built the conditioning to be able to start to look into it? The other things we've been talking about in my trainings this week is what makes a space white. As the NFL is a white space, despite the fact that 70-something% of their players are Black, it's very much a white space. And how many of our spaces are white centered? Is there such a thing as a race neutral space? I really doubt it. And I think about a lot of like teams that I've been a leader on, particularly in the last several years when I've been deeply committed to anti-racism and really deeply committed to disrupting colorblindness and white supremacy culture. I think the closest thing to a race neutral space is to have done so much work around race and racism and recognizing the way white supremacy culture shows up in so many spaces, particularly professional spaces, that you understand your positionality related to privilege and power. And so then it just becomes a human space where people can show up as their full selves, whatever that might be, and we create a sense of belonging. But if we cannot observe each other as all the identities that we are, if we don't make space for that, if we're not willing to sit in discomfort, if we're not willing to have the uncomfortable conversations, then we're just perpetuating a culture of politeness, but not deep intimacy. I remember the other day, someone gave me a call who, we're at the beginning of our relationship, she a white woman, me a Black woman, and she was doing pleasantries of, like looking forward to the Super Bowl and, I'm rooting for the Eagles and, how about you? And I had that checkpoint of like that moment of pause of, should I be honest or should I engage in politeness? And I thought, well, if I'm going to be in a long-term relationship with this person, I'm going to be honest. And so I said, well, I've kind of been boycotting the NFL since Colin Kaepernick in 2016. And there was such awkwardness, right? She didn't know what to say. And there was no shame on my end, but it was like, if we're going to be in relationship together, then I want to show up as my authentic self. And my authentic self says, there's a lot of racism in this country. And there is a racial hierarchy. And if we're not going to be honest with each other about it, I don't know how deep our relationship can go. So I'm inviting you in to intimacy about being racial beings. I hope that you'll join me in the conversation. And most of my conversations these days are in anti-racism revolution. And you're welcome to join at any point. And if you feel like you need support, if you need some accountability, if in your day-to-day life you just kind of blend into colorblindness or assimilating into white-centered spaces, the reality is that most spaces are white-centered, even when there are a whole lot of people of color there. And the spaces that I think are Black-centered or Latina-centered or Asian American oriented or Indigenous-centered, those are beautiful spaces too. And how we miss out when we don't have cross-racial solidarity, where we don't have that intimacy. We haven't built those muscles in our relationships across differences in order to bring that into the room as well. I hope you take good care wherever you are, whatever you're doing.